before the highways, before the headlines. There was a child who never learned what safe felt like. Aileen Wuornos was born in 1956 in Rochester, Michigan, into a life already fractured. Her father, Leo Pittman, was a convicted criminal with a history of violence. He was never a stable presence in her life and would later die in prison. Her mother, Diane, was still a teenager, overwhelmed, unprepared, and unable to provide consistency. Within just a few years, Aileen and her older brother, Keith, were no longer being raised by their parents. They were sent to live with their maternal grandparents. Some children grow up learning trust. Aileen grew up learning how quickly people disappear. From the outside, it looked like a second chance, two children taken in, given a home. But inside, the environment was rigid, volatile, and often harsh. Her grandfather was described as controlling and temperamental. Her grandmother was quiet, often overwhelmed, and unable to shield the children from the tension. Discipline was strict. Affection was scarce. As Aileen grew older, the instability around her deepened. School became less of a refuge and more of another place she didn't fit. She struggled socially. She acted out. She withdrew. Reports and later accounts suggest she experienced abuse during these years, though details remain difficult and complex. What's clear is this: she was a child navigating adult-level fear and confusion with no stable support system. By early adolescence, Aileen's behavior became more volatile. She skipped school frequently, became increasingly aggressive, sought attention in risky ways. Some accounts describe her trading sex for small comforts, food, cigarettes, or a place to stay. Not as a calculated choice, but as survival behavior learned too early. Her grandmother, one of the few somewhat stabilizing figures, died while Aileen was still young. After that, whatever fragile structure existed began to collapse. Her grandfather eventually forced her out of the house as a teenager. No plan, no safety net, no guidance, just gone. Homeless and alone, she drifted. She lived in the woods at times, slept wherever she could, relied on strangers. Chance encounters. An instinct. The road, literal and symbolic, became her life. It wasn't freedom, it was movement without roots. Before the crimes, before the fear, before the name became known, there was a girl shaped by instability, abandonment, and survival. Understanding that beginning doesn't excuse what came later, but it does explain how a life can unravel long before anyone notices. By this point, Aileen Wuornos was no longer part of anything stable. There wasn't a single moment where everything changed. No clear break. It was quieter than that, gradual, one step then another, until there was nothing left to return to. She moved from place to place without much direction. Highways, small towns, stretches of road that all started to look the same after a while. Sometimes she caught rides with strangers, sometimes she didn't. The interactions were brief, transactional in ways that didn't always need to be spoken out loud. People came and went quickly, and over time she stopped expecting anything different. Nights were often the hardest. Bus stations became temporary shelter, metal benches, fluorescent lights, the constant hum of machines. She rarely slept, not deeply anyway. There was always movement, always noise, always the sense that something could happen at any moment. So she stayed alert, watching, learning. At times, she stayed outside wooded areas, abandoned spaces, anywhere she could find a small amount of cover. It wasn't comfort, it was just less exposed. She adapted quickly, figuring out where to sit, where to rest, how to hold on to what little she had. There was no margin for error. Encounters with others were unpredictable. Some people offered help, some kept their distance. Some expected something in return. Over time, those lines blurred. What might have once felt unusual became familiar, and familiarity made it easier to accept. There were moments, brief ones, where things almost felt normal. Sitting outside a store, sharing a cigarette, talking without saying much of anything important. But those moments didn't last, they never did. People moved on, and so did she. Inside stores, she lingered longer than she needed to. Not to buy anything, just to exist somewhere that felt structured. Even if it wasn't hers. A few extra minutes under bright lights, a break from the uncertainty outside, then back out again. Weather didn't change much. Rain came and went. Cold settled in when it wanted to. She kept moving through it. Not because she wanted to, but because stopping didn't offer anything better. By now, her behavior had begun to shift. She pulled further away from anything that resembled structure. School, routine, expectation, those things no longer had a place. What replaced them was something more immediate, more reactive. She became quicker to defend herself, less willing to trust, more focused on control, where she stood, who she spoke to, what she allowed. From the outside, it could look like defiance, but underneath it was something else. Adaptation. There was no plan, no long-term direction, just decisions made moment to moment. Where to go, who to avoid, when to move. Everything was immediate. Everything was about getting through the next hour, the next night. From a distance, it might have looked like freedom, but for Aileen, it was something else entirely. It was movement without roots, without safety, without anywhere to return to. By the time anyone might have noticed the shift, she was already gone. By the time the next phase of her life began, Aileen Wuornos had been living on the margins for years. The road had already shaped how she saw the world, what to expect from people, and what not to expect at all. She eventually settled, at least for a while, in Florida. But settled didn't mean stable. The same patterns followed her. Movement, uncertainty, reliance on strangers. Only now there was something different. Someone. She met Turia Moore in a bar. The connection was immediate. For Aileen, it became one of the few constants she had ever known. There was attachment, dependence, a sense, however fragile, of having someone in her life who stayed. But stability didn't come with it. Money remained inconsistent, housing uncertain. And the life she had been living didn't change. It tightened. The pressure didn't go away. It built. She continued spending time on the highways, getting into cars, meeting strangers, the same environment she had navigated for years. But now the stakes felt higher. More need, more urgency. Then something shifted, not all at once, but enough to change everything that followed. The first violent encounter was later described by Aileen as an act of self-defense. Her account was that she had been threatened, that she reacted out of fear. But what mattered most was that it didn't end there. Over the following months, a pattern began to emerge across Florida. Men, most of them middle-aged, were found deceased in remote areas, often near highways. At first, the cases seemed unrelated, different locations, different circumstances. But investigators began to notice similarities. Vehicles were found abandoned far from where the victims were discovered. Witnesses recalled seeing a woman traveling along the same routes. The pieces didn't fit perfectly, but they were close enough to start forming a picture. Case by case, the pattern grew clearer. Richard Mallory, David Spears, Charles Carskadden, Troy Burris, Dick Humphreys, Walter Antonio, and one man, Peter Seams, whose vehicle was found but whose body was never recovered. To investigators, it became a connected series. To Aileen, the explanation was different. She maintained that each encounter was a reaction, that she had felt threatened, cornered, and responded accordingly. The truth, as often happens, was complicated. What could be proven? What could be claimed? What could be believed? Those lines didn't always align. As the investigation intensified, law enforcement began closing in. Descriptions matched more closely. Movements became easier to track. And eventually, attention turned toward someone close to her. Turia Moore. She had been there through much of this time, living alongside Aileen, sharing in the same unstable environment. But as the investigation grew, so did the pressure. Under questioning, Turia agreed to cooperate. What followed became one of the most pivotal moments in the case. She made a series of monitored phone calls to Aileen, conversations that were recorded. In those calls, she urged her to speak openly, to explain what had happened. And Aileen did. Those conversations provided investigators with what they needed. Not a single piece of evidence, but a confirmation, a connection, a voice tying everything together. Shortly after, Aileen was located and taken into custody. At first she denied involvement. Then over time her story shifted. She began to speak more openly about the encounters, about what she believed had happened, about how she saw her actions. The case quickly drew national attention, not just because of the number of victims, but because of who she was. A woman, living on the margins, accused of a series of violent acts that challenged expectations. Once Aileen Wuornos was in custody, the focus shifted, from investigation to prosecution, from what happened on the road to what could be proven in a courtroom. She was formally charged in multiple cases. Prosecutors chose to move forward with one case first, a strategy designed to establish a foundation, build the narrative, present the evidence, secure a conviction, then move forward from there. The prosecution's argument was structured and direct. They presented physical evidence tied to the victims and their vehicle's testimony, placing her in contact with several of the men. Recorded conversations and statements patterns connecting the cases across locations and time. They emphasized consistency, not one isolated incident, but a sequence, a pattern that suggested intent rather than coincidence. The defense took a different approach. They centered their case on Aileen's account, that each encounter had been driven by fear, that she believed she was in danger, that her actions were reactions, not premeditated decisions. They also brought forward her history, a childhood marked by instability, a life shaped by survival, not as justification, but as context for how she perceived threat and how she responded to it. When Aileen spoke, the courtroom shifted. Her statements were direct, at times emotional, at times controlled. She maintained that she had been threatened in those encounters, that she acted out of fear for her safety, that her actions were not planned in advance. But her testimony was also challenged. Inconsistencies were pointed out, details were questioned, timelines were examined closely, mental health professionals were brought in. They evaluated her psychological state, her past trauma, her perception of danger. Some testimonies suggested long-term impact from her early life. Others focus on her awareness and decision-making at the time. The courtroom was left with a central question. Was this a pattern of calculated behavior, or a series of reactions shaped by fear? The jury wasn't asked to solve her life. They were asked to decide what the evidence showed, what intent could be established, what version of events was most credible. They listened to testimony, recorded conversations, forensic details, competing narratives, and then they deliberated. In the first trial, the case involving Richard Mallory, the jury deliberated for approximately 2 hours before reaching a verdict. The verdict was read guilty. What followed was the penalty phase, where the question was no longer what happened, but what should happen next. The jury recommended the most severe sentence available under Florida law. The judge accepted that recommendation. Sentence: death. Prosecutors moved forward with additional cases. Not all at once, but one by one. David Spears, verdict: guilty. Sentence: death. Charles Carskadoon, verdict: guilty. Sentence: death. Troy Burrows, verdict: guilty. Sentence: death. Deke Humphreys, she entered a no-contest plea. Sentence: death. Walter Antonio, verdict: guilty. Sentence: life imprisonment. Across these proceedings, a pattern formed, not just in the charges, but in the outcomes. Juries consistently found the evidence sufficient, the intent established, the accounts unpersuasive when weighed against the full record, and again they returned the same recommendation. By the end, there were no more arguments left to make, no more witnesses to call, no more versions of events to compare. Only the record and what had already been decided. The courts had spoken. Again and again, the outcomes were consistent, the conclusions reinforced over time. But long before any verdict, there had been a different story unfolding. One shaped by instability, by movement, by survival. A life that didn't follow a straight line but instead drifted from place to place, from moment to moment. And somewhere along that path things changed, whether gradually or all at once, depends on who is telling it. In the courtroom, those details were examined, measured, questioned, but a courtroom can only do so much. It can determine responsibility, it can weigh evidence, it can reach a conclusion, but it cannot fully reconstruct a life. It cannot go back to the beginning and change the conditions that shaped it. In the end, what remained was a series of decisions, by investigators, by attorneys, by juries, and eventually by Aileen herself. The appeals stopped. The process moved forward, and on October 9th, 2002, the case reached its final point, not with chaos, not with noise, but with a procedure. Quiet, controlled, final. What remains now is not just the outcome, but the questions that came with it, about how a life unfolds, about where responsibility begins and where understanding ends, about the space between those two things and how difficult it can be to define. Because in the end, this was never just one moment. It was a sequence, a progression, a life that moved step by step until there was nowhere left to go. And by the time the world was watching, most of it had already happened.